Hey guys, it's JP. Welcome to my project about magical realism. So to start, let's talk about what magical realism actually is. Magical realism is a writing style that incorporates magic into your everyday life. So this could be anywhere from the park, at school, in the library, or even in a bar. And in these settings, magic is going to be sprinkled along and not questioned whatsoever. It's not weird, it's not wild, it's not crazy, it's not surprising. Types of magic would include talking dogs, inanimate objects coming to life, or even the dead coming back to life. Like I said, this is never questioned, just kind of accepted. Another element is going to be your limited information and your unique plot structure. So there's no real beginning, end, or middle to any of these stories. It's just kind of a snippet of what you would think or should be a larger story, but it's not. You're just getting one little piece of this. Another element of magical realism is going to be the critique of society. So it could be politics or a political figure, it could be a social movement, it could be beauty standards, literally any type of critique of society. Now, it's not in all of these stories, but it's in quite a bit of them. Those are the elements that kind of comprise magical realism of what it actually is. So now let's talk about how magical realism actually came to be. Magical realism started as a reaction to the realism movement. It's most often associated with Latin American authors, starting in around the 1920s and then gaining popularity in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Essentially, magical realism was a chance for authors to show an alternative to an accepted reality. This can be an incredibly powerful tool against political regimes and somewhat explain the turbulent times that they were living in. Although mostly associated with Latin American authors, there are some examples of magical realism earlier on. One example of this would be Nikolai Gogol's 1836 story, The Nose. This story is about a man who wakes up and discovers his nose has detached from his body and starts his own life.
Это хорошо одет нос, который идет вокруг здания.
Another example would be what we've all read, The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. We'll get more to that later. So now let's talk about how magical realism differs from fantasy and regular realism. When you think of fantasy, you think of Harry Potter, you think of Game of Thrones.
Only I can live forever.
This differs from magical realism because they have their own worlds, they have their own languages, they have their own rules. These things are not magical realism. You're set in your regular mundane life, like I said, at the park, at a bar, in this reality, with just magic sprinkled alongside of it. So if we go into regular realism, we read books like Separate Ways, which is realism. But if we were to take Okio's sewing machine that she used and bam, it worked by itself, then it would turn into magical realism. So now that we know what magical realism is and isn't, let's talk about Death Constant Beyond Love by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Marquez was born in 1927 in Colombia. He was one of the most famous writers of his time, winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982. To this day, his novel 100 Years of Solitude is still considered one of the best novels of all time. The novel featured many elements of magical realism, including a flying carpet, a rainstorm that lasted 4 years, 11 months, and 2 days, and a character whose farts are so strong they kill all the flowers in the house. Sounds like me. Marquez began his career as a journalist, which allowed him to travel the world, but his fictional writings were inspired by his grandparents, as we can see in this interview right here.
Entonces para mí era una vida muy curiosa, porque las mujeres presididas por mi abuela vivían en un mundo sobrenatural, un mundo fantástico donde todo era posible, donde las cosas más maravillosas eran simplemente cotidianas, y yo me acostumbré a pensar así. Pero el abuelo era probablemente el ser más concreto que yo conocí, y sus historias eran las historias de la guerra civil, las peripecias de la política, y me hablaba a mí como si yo fuera un adulto. Y entonces yo vivía repartido entre esos dos mundos.
Marquez also cited Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis as an early influence on his writing. saying, "The first line almost knocked me off the bed. I was so surprised." It reads, "As Gregor Samsa awoke that morning from an uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect." Which, when I read that line, I thought to myself, I didn't know anyone was allowed to write things like that. If I had known, I would have started writing a long time ago. So I immediately started writing short stories. So now let's talk about Death Constant Beyond Love. The story is about Senator Sanchez, who goes to a new town to promote his campaign. So at the beginning of the story, we find out that he only has 6 months and 11 days to live. He has his campaign speech, and he has his crew bring out the whole smoke and mirrors of a new town he's built for them, all cardboard, for them to see of what he's going to promise them. After his campaign speech, he goes to wander the village, and he runs into Nelson. Nelson is a man who is twice widowed, and his first wife he murdered so he can marry his second, buried his first wife in a cauliflower patch. After this, he moved to this new town with his new wife, and they have a daughter. His daughter's name is Laura. So as Senator Sanchez is walking through the city, he comes across Nelson again. Nelson, running from the law, has asked Sanchez for the past 7 years for a new identification card so he can escape the law and start a new life. He's always said no. That is until he runs into Laura. So when the senator sees Laura, he falls madly in love with her. Thinks to himself, it's the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. Well, Nelson notices this and tells Laura later that night to go visit him. So upon walking up to the room, Laura sees a calendar flying like a butterfly. The senator throws it out the room and it flies to the wall and sticks to the wall. Upon that, the guards see her, as well as the senator, and the senator invites her into the room. The guards leave, it's just them two by themselves. As she walks in, she notices thousands of paper bills flying around the room. As soon as the senator turns off the fan, all of the paper bills fly and stick to something. That's when the senator invites her to bed. They get all touchy-feely, and he notices a chastity belt around her waist. And that's when Laura says he could have her as long as he gives her father the identification card he's been wanting for a while. The senator agrees, and Laura offers to get the key at that moment. The senator says no, just lay with me. It's good to be with someone when you're so alone. Within 6 months, the senator will be lying there, in that same position, dying without Laura amid a public scandal. So now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What makes this story magical realism? Well, to start, the realistic setting. It's about a senator going to an average old town, which honestly is kind of poor, which makes it even more realistic. Not fancy, not crazy, nothing wild, to go and promote his new campaign for his re-election. So now let's talk about the elements of magic in this story. Let me start by saying this story is very simple compared to his other works. All we really have are the two different elements. It's going to be the calendar flying out the room and painting itself to a wall, as well as the thousands of paper banknotes flying around in the room when Laura enters. None of this is questioned or surprising, or no one really cares about it. It's accepted. So now let's talk about the lack of information in the story. We do know that this story takes place over 1 day in Senator Sanchez's life. As far as characters go, we know little to nothing about them. With Senator Sanchez, we know he's a senator on a campaign trail trying to be reelected with a wife and 5 kids at home and only 6 months and 11 days to live. With Nelson, we do know he's running from the law. He killed his first wife, and his second wife died of natural causes, leaving him with Laura. And with Laura, all we really know about her is that it's Nelson's daughter from his second marriage. Furthermore, with Laura, we don't really know how she feels about selling herself to Senator Sanchez. Is she okay with it? Is she happy with it? Is she just doing it to help her father? We don't know. So now let's talk about the unique plot structure. The story really only takes place within 1 day of the senator's life. However, there is a bit of foreshadowing knowing that he only has a short time to live. After his night of meeting Laura, the story jumps 6 months to the day of his death. We have no idea what happened in between then. How did the sex scandal emerge? Where is his wife? Where is his kids? Where is Laura? We know nothing of what happened to Laura. All these questions remain unanswered. So now let's talk about my favorite, the critique of society. Most prevalent in this story is going to be the critique of political figures. Senator Sanchez
uses his smoke and mirrors to make false promises to the people of this pile of goat dung town. His words, not mine. Then, within a day of being there, pursues an extramarital affair. Sounds like someone I know. Am I right? Marquez uses these fictional characters to paint a picture of the Latin American politics during this time.
So there you have it. Magical realism and death constant beyond love. Hope you enjoyed my project. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.
Dad, can I go play now?
Yes, Rascal, we can go outside now. Come on.